Hello there and welcome to Botany 101. I'm Angela Nishimoto and I'm your host for this tour that we're going to do of the angiosperms. Okay? So that's what we're introducing you to do today. Okay, the angiosperms. Okay, we've talked about them before. These are also known as the flowering plants. All right? So, they number more than 250,000 species. And of all the members of the kingdom Plantae, they're the largest and most diverse phylum or division in the whole kingdom. Okay, they're the dominant plant form on Earth today on the terrestrial environment, except for the coniferous forests, which we've talked about before. Okay, so the word angiosperm. Okay, and angion means vessel or container, like they say angi for blood vessels, like angiogenesis, when a tumor actually starts making or creating vessels near it. Okay, so angion means vessel or container, and sperma, of course, as we know from before, means seed. Okay. So the vessel itself is also known as a carpel. We've been introduced to this terminology before, okay? And what is a carpel? A carpel is an inrolled leaf with seeds, okay? For example, we have a green pea pod, okay? Also known as a legume, okay? So if you have one or more carpels, that makes up the pistil. Okay, so it's like the green pea pod. The leaves are like folded over on one edge and fused at the margins. Okay, and they enclose the seeds within them. So it's a fruit. Okay, so the ovary becomes a fruit. The ovule becomes a seed. Okay, and the fertilized egg, after the egg and sperm unite, it becomes a zygote, and the zygote develops into the embryo, which is a new baby generation. Okay, so these plants, these angiosperms, okay, or flowering plants, have covered seeds, which distinguish them from the naked seed, gymnosperms. Okay, so all the angiosperms are in the phylum Magnoliophyta. Okay, the Magnoliophyta are also synonymous with what used to be called the Anthophyta. Okay, they're also known as the flowering plants. Okay, so they're in two classes. Okay, you have the Magnoliopsida or the dicots. Here's some nice magnolia flowers. Look at the many parts of the petal-like structures here. Okay, those are the dicots. Okay, so this is a representative of what they call a primitive dicot. Okay, and we also have the Liliopsida, the monocots. This is actually a photograph of what looks like the Philippine ground orchid. Looks like an orchid kind of plant to me from what I can see here. Maybe, maybe not. I can't really see very closely, but it sort of looks like a, it looks like it's growing up in the mountains. Okay. Anyway, so the Liliopsida are the monocots. Remember dicots and monocots? Yeah, you should know that by now. Okay. And the angiosperms are the most diverse of plants in the kingdom Plantae. Okay. And of course, the ancestors of angiosperms evolved from gymnosperms that are now extinct. Okay, and flowers evolved. Okay, and why did flowers evolve? To take advantage of animals in their sexual reproduction. Okay, in two ways. First of all, you have the transfer of pollen. Okay, from an anther to a stigma, that's called pollination. It's usually facilitated by some kind of animal, oftentimes an insect. Okay, and they also take advantage of animals in terms of seed dispersal, because many animals will actually eat the seeds. okay, along with the fruit, or eat the fruit along with the seeds, and then disperse the seeds in the droppings, like birds, like mammals, okay? Here's an image of a bee. Actually, what the bee is doing, she's actually collecting pollen or getting nectar, okay? That's what she's doing for herself. But in the meantime, she's also affecting pollination between one flower and another, or cross-pollination in many cases, okay? Now, in 1859, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection was published. By who? Do you remember? It was Charles Darwin, right? Since then, they've had two main theories on how angiosperms actually started, how they originated, okay? The older of the two main theories was kind of put forth by Adolf Engler and his followers, okay? But this theory on the origin of angiosperms is now mostly disregarded. Okay, so here's a picture of Engler. Okay, so their ideas were that angiosperms evolved from conifers. Okay, remember conifers, the Pinophyta? Okay, so they held that the angiosperms evolved from conifers, and that primitive flowers are similar to the strobili. Remember the strobili of the conifers or the Pinophyta? Okay, that's what they said. So they thought that the primitive flowers would have been inconspicuous, okay, or not very large and not very showy, and they would be in clusters, many flowers all in one place, okay. Some examples of these types of flowers include the flowers of grasses, okay, oaks, and willows and cattails. I know that here in Hawaii we might not be that much acquainted with oaks and willows and cattails, but probably you've seen at least photographs or seen them in movies or in magazines. Yeah, but we are familiar with grasses. Okay. Now also, most botanists of today use the anatomical and chemical and fossil evidence, as well as cladistics. Remember, cladistics is a way you can actually show how one plant is related to another. It's like a system, okay? And what they say is that angiosperms evolved from teratosperms. Remember the seed ferns that we talked about? Okay? And the flower is a modified stem with modified leaves. Remember what Goethe said, alles ist Blatt, right? It's all leaf, right? That's what the flower is. It's actually a modified short shoot axis with modified leaves, okay? So here's a look at seed fern fossil that you've seen before, very nice fossil, kind of showing the compound leaves of this plant, okay? So these primitive flowers have a long receptacle and many spirally arranged parts, okay? And generally, some of these parts are not differentiated into sepals and petals. They're just like flaps, okay? They're like leaves, of course, modified leaves, but they're not really visually differentiated into sepals and petals like you do in more advanced flowers, okay? Also, the stamens and carpels are flattened and numerous, okay? So examples of these types of flowers are magnolias and buttercups. Okay, these are more like temperate area flowers, even though I have seen magnolias blooming in Hawaii. Okay, so here's a magnolia flower. You can see that you have these parts here, not necessarily differentiated into sepals and petals. Here you have the numerous stamens, okay. Here you have numerous carpels, okay, actually numerous pistils probably, okay. Buttercup, the same thing. They're a little harder to see because it's yellow on yellow. You have 5 petals, okay. I don't see any sepals. I don't see any sepals in the back of it. And you have some stamens, which are also yellow, yellow on yellow, or golden on golden. And here you have the maybe many-parted pistil, Okay? So, many botanists believe, okay, that, let's see, that all modern angiosperms are derived from primitive stock, okay? And these primitive stock had those particular characteristics, you know, the many parts and the flattened anthers and etc. Okay, so here's a book from Linnaeus's work, and here you actually see the anthers. Remember his sexual system that we talked about before? You have numerous stamens, few stamens, fewer stamens. So remember that he actually used the sexual system or number of stamens and their arrangement and how they were arranged in relation to the pistil and the petals as well. Okay, even though that the sexual system was later to be discredited because it was not a natural system. Okay, now flowering plants. Okay, the flowering plants are the angiosperms. Okay, they vary tremendously in terms of size, shape, texture, and form. Also, in how long they live. There's some that live only a few weeks, actually, that they seed and they grow and they flower and fruit only in a few weeks. Some maybe even in just several days. Okay, there's some that live for a very long time. Okay, thousands of years. Remember the bristlecone pines? Okay, so the phylum Magnoliophyta includes duckweeds, grasses and palms, because remember grasses and palms are flowering plants, even if their flowers are not that conspicuous. Okay, many aquatic plants such as the sea grasses and things like elodea or epiphytic plants. Plants that live on other plants without causing those other plants harm. Most shrubs and trees or woody plants, okay, are in the phylum Magnoliophyta. Okay, so one example of a tree is the Eucalyptus regnans of Tasmania. Okay, here, over here on the left, we can see duckweed, okay, in Waimanalo. Okay, so see how small the plants are? Very small. Only like a couple of millimeters large, okay, a few millimeters large. And here's some flowers of eucalyptus. So eucalyptuses are related to paper bark. You know, you can see they have very similar flowers and fruits. And they're also related to Ohia lehua. Okay, they're in the Myrtaceae. See what else are they related to? They're related to, let's see, allspice and what do you call that? Another plant that has fragrant oils in it. Okay. Now we have some flowering plants actually being parasitic. They have a little bit of a different lifestyle than other plants do. Okay, so the daughters, also known as kaunaoa. Okay, so we do have a native species of daughter that lives in Hawaii, Cascuta. Okay, and it forms these like plastic-looking orange string, but it is actually a flowering plant. Okay, so what they'll do is they're parasitic. They live off other living plants. What they'll do is they'll send their specialized roots called haustoria into the phloem of other plants and suck up the sugars from the other plants that the other plants make through photosynthesis, and that's how they sustain themselves. Okay, so you have parasitic plants such as the daughters. Okay, we have some plants that are hemiparasitic or sort of half parasitic. They actually do have green leaves. Okay, so they do some photosynthesis, like this mistletoe. Okay, also iliahi, also known as sandalwood or santalum species, also are hemiparasitic in that they do make some of their own food through photosynthesis, but they also send their haustoria into the phloem of other plants and suck up sugars from other plants. So they're sort of half. Hemi means half, like hemisphere is like half of the globe. Okay, so hemiparasitic means they're kind of half parasitic. Okay. Then we have some plants that are saprophytic. Okay, what does that mean? Saprophytic means that they live off dead organic matter. Okay, so what we have here, that you can see here, is Sarcodia, okay, sanguinea, or snow plant. You can see that you don't see any green in this plant. So this plant doesn't do any photosynthesis at all. Okay, it actually lives from detritus that it takes up from its roots. Okay, from nutrients from detritus or dead plant and animal material. Okay, also the ghost orchid, which is famous, I think, in a book that was published maybe over 10 years ago, right? The Orchid Thief, I think it was called. So it had to do with the ghost orchids of Florida. Okay, and a man who was being prosecuted for harvesting them. Now, otherwise, except for the parasites, except for the hemiparasites, and except for the saprophytes, almost all plants do photosynthesis to make food. Remember photosynthesis, which we talked about at least several times over the course of this semester? Okay, so almost all the phylum Magnolia phyta do photosynthesis for food. Okay? Now, angiosperms are heterosporous, like gymnosperms are. Remember what heterosporous means? It means that you have one kind of spore that makes female, you have another kind of spore that makes male. Okay? Remember heterospory? We actually saw heterospory in, let's see, we saw heterospory in Selaginella. Remember, that's one of the club mosses. We also saw heterospory in Marsilia, which is a kind of fern. Right, so heterospory is something that is true of all angiosperms. They're all heterosporous. That's an advanced trait. Okay, so in this heterospory, the sporophytes are even more dominant in the angiosperms than in the gymnosperms. Okay, so they're even more dominant. The female gametophyte is completely enclosed within the sporophyte and completely dependent upon the sporophyte. Okay, so the sporophyte actually has another maternal investment in the offspring of the next generation. Okay, now it's only a few cells, the female gametophyte. Okay, so this few cells, you also have a male gametophyte is only a few cells large also. It's a pollen grain that has 3 nuclei. Okay, that's the male gametophyte, a pollen grain with 3 nuclei. Okay, so the gametophytes are very much reduced in this. Remember that when we were talking about the bryophytes, the gametophyte was dominant, right? Now we see in these more advanced plants, the angiosperms, you actually have the sporophyte being way dominant over the gametophytes, okay? So in terms of the development of gametophytes, okay? So the megasporocyte, or the megaspore mother cell, okay, does meiosis, okay? So this, of course, the development of the gametophyte, okay, the megasporophyte does meiosis and produces 4 megaspores, okay? Now 3 of them die. 3 of them actually desiccate and die, but 1 does mitosis, okay? Then these 2 cells that results from that mitosis then divide, and then the 4 cells that result from that mitosis then divide also. So you end up with 8 nuclei, okay? You end up with 8 haploid nuclei, okay? And they have no cell walls between them, okay? And during the time that these meiosis and mitosis have been going on, the cell would have grown, okay? And you have 2 outer layers, which develops into the integument, which develops into the seed coat, okay? Eventually, okay? And there's an opening at one end of the ovule, okay, and that's the micropyle. Remember micropyle? Here it's spelled a little bit differently, but it means the same thing, okay? And these 8 nuclei that we were talking about rearrange themselves into what we call the megagametophyte. That's just the female gametophyte, okay? the megagametophyte. 8 nuclei rearrange into the megagametophyte. We'll see that in a minute. Okay, so this megagametophyte used to be called the embryo sac. Okay, I guess they no longer call it that, even though sometimes I still call it that myself. Okay, now meanwhile, okay, while this meiosis and mitosis have been going on with the megasporocyte, okay, in the anther you have patches of tissue differentiating, okay, at the same time that the megagametophyte is developing, okay, and many of these microsporocytes, micro, remember, means male, okay, so many of these microsporocytes do meiosis. So you have one cell producing 4 cells, because remember, meiosis has to do with 2 divisions, right? The reduction division and the mitotic division, right? So each microsporocyte would produce a tetrad, okay, or quartet of microspores. Okay, so these are male part, yeah? And then if you actually have an anther cross-section, you could see 4 pollen sacs at this stage. Okay, and then after meiosis, the microspores change. The microspore does mitosis and produces these cells. Okay, so the generative cell is small, and the generative cell is inside the tube cell, the second cell. Okay. Then the members of the tetrads, and sometimes you can see when you're looking at a cross-section of a lily anther or something like that. Okay, so what happens is that this, after the microspores change, which can take between 1 day and a couple of weeks, okay, the members of the tetrads separate, okay. Then you have a 2-layered wall developing around each microspore. And these become pollen grains, okay? And the pollen grains has an outer wall called an exene. Remember those two, that double wall around them? That becomes the exene. The exene part of it has chemicals, okay, that react with chemicals in the pistil, okay? So they react with chemicals that come from the pistil or the stigma, or the stigmatic part of the pistil, but it has to be the right pollen, okay? So the pollen may germinate or not, depending if the pollen is the right pollen, okay? Generally, the pollen needs to be of the same species in many cases, okay? Even though we have seen some cases where you can actually have different genera crossing with each other. But usually there are barriers to actual pollination, okay, and fertilization, okay? So the pollen may germinate or not, depending, okay? So the pollen can be of the same species, okay, but it might have to be from a different plant, or it might have to be from a different variety, okay? And let's see. And in some cases, the pollen may germinate even if it's of a different genus, you know, even though the 2 plants are different genera, okay? So that can happen, but it often doesn't, because generally what usually happens is that many plants have pollinator specificity. So the pollinator, or the animal that moves pollen from an anther of one plant to the stigma of another plant, is very specific as to the species that it will actually pollinate, okay? We'll see that later, okay? Now the cytoplasm, of course, of pollen is very rich in vitamins. Okay, that's one of the reasons why bees and other insects collect it, okay? And it's also sold as a supplement in health food stores. Okay, you have pollen that they sell, okay? Now the exene, the outer wall of the pollen grain, is practically indestructible. Okay, this is kind of some interesting stuff, okay? You've actually found pollen that were thousands of years old, and they are able to identify the plants, or identify that the plants do not exist anymore from thousands of years ago. And in fact, they've done things like doing a pollen core of, coring, and you're sending a drill down into the sediments of Kauai Nui Marsh, and they've been able to say what kind of plants grew there like 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, because of course these islands are old enough so that they do have a history of plants here even before humans came here too. So they can do pollen cores and find what kind of plants lived in a particular area at a particular time, so they can demonstrate succession where one kind of vegetation kind of overtakes and takes over from another kind of vegetation. Okay. Another thing, so pollen is used in archaeological investigations, so it's very, very important for archaeological investigations. Okay. They're crucial, okay, because the sculpture of the Exene is distinctive, so you can actually identify. Okay, so the sculpturing of the Exene is distinctive, so you can actually differentiate between different members of different families, different genera, even between different species in the same genera or genus. Okay, so what they can do is you can actually use these pollen grains for forensic investigations, like for criminal cases, you know, such as somebody brushing against some pollen somewhere, getting it on their clothes, and then saying they've never been there, but then they find pollen from the plant on their clothes, okay, showing that they might have been there at some time, even if it's not necessarily at the time that the prosecution is necessarily saying that it's so. Okay, so it's very important. So some people, they're actually palynologists, people who just spend their career studying pollen. Okay, now many pollen grains have 3 apertures. Okay, they're pore-like. Okay, but the number may be 1 aperture, or you may have many apertures. Okay, and remember that the generative nucleus that we talked about a little earlier divides, okay, and produces sperms. And in angiosperms, the sperms have no flagella, okay, so they do not swim necessarily, okay. Anyway, so the vegetative nucleus is what they call the tube nucleus. Okay. So here we see the, let's see. We can see the anther here, okay, and the microspore, so-called microspore mother cell, or the microsporocyte, okay, undergoing meiosis, producing a tetrad of cells. Okay, and each of these tetrads will eventually develop into a pollen grain. Okay, and here you have a generative cell, and here you have the tube cell that we were just talking about. Okay, so this is a microgametophyte pollen, or pollen. Okay, and here the pollen grain here. Okay, when it germinates up on top of the stigma, this is a stigma of a pistil. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later to talk about fertilization. But here you have the megaspore, okay, or what they're calling here the macrospore or ovule, okay. You see it has 8 cells in here, right? And these 8 cells have 3 antipodals on one side, 2 synergids, an egg, and 2 what they used to call polar nuclei, but now they call them the central cells. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, so this here is the embryo sac or the megagametophyte. Okay, just a few cells large, just like the pollen grain. So here you see the megagametophyte and the microgametophyte are both very small. They're just a few cells large. Okay, of course, the megagametophyte is larger than the microgametophyte, okay, or the pollen. Okay, so the megagametophyte is just a few cells large, 8 cells large, and the microgametophyte is, at this stage, 2 cells large. Okay. Now, what is pollination? Pollination is merely the transfer of pollen, okay, from an anther to a stigma. Okay, so fertilization may not occur for days after pollination, or weeks, or even months after pollination, depending on the species, depending on how their individual metabolism is, okay? So fertilization may not even occur at all if it's the wrong pollen, okay? Sometimes pollen won't even germinate, you know, because it's the wrong pollen. It needs to be the right pollen, okay? Flowers are very picky, okay? So pollination is usually affected by insects or wind, but it can also be affected by water or birds or bats or other mammals such as mice, okay? Also by gravity. So you have actually here a physical force that can actually affect pollination. And some flowers do self-pollination. So we've talked about this before, okay? There are some flowers that are self-fertile, among them the Philippine ground orchid, which is naturalized in Hawaii. Okay, they actually, flowers don't even open all the way, and they self-pollinate all the time. That's why they kind of grow up in the mountains and in cleared areas. Now after pollination, okay, what happens is that further development of the male gametophyte may not happen at all, okay, depending on whether it's the right pollen or not. So the pollen needs to be from a different plant of the same species in many cases. Okay, so that many plants are not self-fertile, they're self-incompatible. Okay, or they have to be from a different variety, okay, of the same species. Okay, except for some crop plants. Okay, crop plants are a whole entity unto themselves, such as wheat, rice, oats, peas, and beans. Okay. Anyway, after pollination, the cytoplasm, so if everything's right, all the systems are go, okay? The cytoplasm of the pollen absorbs fluid from the stigma. The cytoplasm of the pollen bulges, okay? It bulges and it actually forms a pollen tube, okay? And the pollen tube grows through the stigma and through the style, okay? Then finally reaches that little pore, right, in the wall, reaches a micropyle in the ovary, okay? And in corn, these pollen tubes can grow 20 inches long, okay? It's amazing, okay? So it goes through the micropyle, if conditions are right, okay, and discharges the contents of the pollen, okay, and it grows through the micropyle, and you have the vegetative nucleus at the tip, okay. The generative cell lags, and that's actually going to be the two sperms, okay. So the tube nucleus is at the tip, and the generative cell lags behind, okay, and that produces two sperms, okay. So the male gametophyte is generally a pollen with three nuclei, remember? So it's pollen with a vegetative nucleus and two sperms. Okay, that's what the male gametophyte is. Okay? So the pollen tube then continues on, it goes through the micropyle and continues to the female gametophyte. Okay? Here you have the pollen tube. Okay, the tube nucleus, the two sperm nuclei kind of lagging behind. Okay? So what happens is that the pollen tube grows through the stigma, grows through the style, goes into the ovary, okay, here, all right? And then what happens, we'll see that in a little bit, okay, but anyway, what will eventually happen is that you'll have fertilization happening, okay? So you have double fertilization where one sperm plus an egg becomes a single-celled zygote, and the zygote later develops into the embryo. So in flowering plants, you have a special situation called double fertilization, okay? So one sperm fertilizes the egg, the other sperm fertilizes those two central cell nuclei. So then what you end up with is triploid endosperm. You remember endosperm actually surrounds the embryo, okay? And the formation of endosperm is a major development, okay, in terms of evolution flowering plants. Okay, this endosperm is a superior form of nutrition for the embryo. Okay, and eventually in the endosperm you may have hundreds of thousands of nuclei in there. Okay, and of course they also become a major source of nutrients for humans. We've been through this many times before: wheat, corn, rice, barley, oats. Okay, the endosperm is actually mostly what we're eating. Okay, so wheat, rice, and corn, other kinds of grasses. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Okay, this is actually showing corn. This is a silk. Okay, so this is the one that's 20 inches long that the pollen tube needs to grow, and then enters into the embryo sac, or the female gametophyte, the megagametophyte. And in the megagametophyte, here you have 2 sperm cells, 2 sperm nuclei. Here you have the central cells, or the polar nuclei. Here you have the egg. Okay, and here's the pollen tube, and the pollen tube will discharge the sperm cells into the female gametophyte. Okay, and here you have 1 sperm fusing with the egg. Okay, that becomes the embryo, and you have 1 sperm fusing with the 2 central cells, or polar nuclei, and that divides and divides and divides and becomes this nutritive tissue known as the endosperm. Okay, very nutritious. Oils and proteins and carbohydrates, you know, everything you need. Okay, so some monocots, such as corn and other grasses, the endosperm becomes part of the seed. Okay, but in most dicots, such as beans and peas, the endosperm eventually is absorbed by the cotyledons. Remember cotyledons, or seed leaves, with monocots having 1 cotyledon and dicots having 2 cotyledons? Yes? That was a long time ago. Now the integuments harden and becomes a seed coat. The ovule becomes a seed. The ovary becomes a fruit. Here we have a fruit of some kind of a squash, some kind of cucurbitaceae. Okay, here's a flower. So this one has an inferior ovary, where the ovary is actually under or beneath the attachment parts of the flower. Okay, so here you can see the petals, or maybe the sepals. Here you have what's left of the anthers. Oh, here are the anthers. Okay, because these are unisexual flowers, the cucurbitaceae. Okay. Now sometimes you have a situation called apomixis, or you can have parthenocarpy. Okay, in apomixis you have no fusion of gametes, but what happens is that the embryo develops anyway. Okay, normal structures are involved. Okay, so for example, the embryo can develop from a 2 or diploid nutritive cell, or other diploid cell of the ovule. Okay, that's called apomixis. So we actually saw this in dandelions before. And so the plant that results is a clone of the parent, of the maternal parent. Okay, and here's a Poa bulbosa, which is showing vegetative apomixis. These little plantlets growing here from the flowers. Okay, you can actually even have angiogenesis happening sometimes, where the plant can actually develop from pollen. Dr. Kamemoto actually demonstrated that happens in Dendrobium orchids. Okay, so you can actually have it developing from female cells or from male cells, either way. Okay, depending on the plant. Now parthenocarpy, what happens then? Fruit develop from ovaries with unfertilized eggs. Okay, so generally they're mostly seedless. Okay, so some examples of these are navel oranges, Bananas, we talked about bananas before. Those little black dots inside them are unfertilized ovules. You have some figs and some grapes, and here you have seedless watermelon. Okay, so these come through parthenocarpy. Remember, parthenocarpy means virgin birth. So what happens is that you have a fruit developing even though the eggs were not fertilized. Okay, that's desirable to us humans because what's easier to eat, right? A fruit with seeds or fruit without seeds. I mean, with watermelon, you can swallow the seeds, but then somebody will tease you and tell you that you're going to grow a watermelon, you know. Okay. Now we have trends of classification. Okay. So first classifications were for convenience. Okay. Remember theophrastis, herbs, semi-shrubs and shrubs and trees, right? Now we also have systems where plants are lumped together in unnatural groupings, like when you have say a nature guide to the wild plants of the northeastern part of the United States or something in Canada. Sometimes you can actually have them lumped together, like all the white flower plants are lumped together because they make it easier for the person who's in the field and may not be familiar with the niceties of taxonomy to actually find and identify white flowered plants. So they'll group all the white flowered plants together, all the yellow flowered plants together, all the pink flowered plants together. Okay, so that's actually unnatural artificial groupings, okay? Because not all white flowers are related to each other, or not that closely anyway, even though we're all related after all, right? And just like long-haired dogs, just because a dog has long hair doesn't mean it's necessarily that closely related to another dog with long hair, okay? Like, I guess Shetland sheepdogs and Maltese are not necessarily that closely related, okay? So botanists try to group plants according to natural relationships, okay? So some trends of specialization, okay? So angiosperms first appeared approximately 160 million years ago during the late Jurassic period, okay? The oldest known fossil is from China, which was discovered in 1998. Okay, and that's actually of a carpel, folded over carpel encasing seeds on a plant, and that's 142 million years old, or been dated, radiocarbon dated to 142 million years old. So about there, about in the same ballpark, 160 million years or 142 million years. Okay, now primitive flowers. Okay, they have simple leaves. They have numerous spirally arranged parts that are not fused. Here we have a magnolia flower. You can see that these modified leaves, okay, remember that all these floral parts are modified leaves, are not really differentiated into sepals and petals, okay, and they're not fused too. They're actually free from each other, okay. Variable in number. Sometimes magnolias can have 5 petals, sometimes it can have 6 petals, sometimes it can have 7 petals, sometimes it can have 8 petals. Okay, look at all the stamens. Look at all these stamens here. You can hardly even count them. Primitive flowers also have what they call a superior ovary. That doesn't mean that the ovary is superior. It does actually mean that the ovary is superior. What happens is that the ovary is actually above the attachment point of the rest of the flower. Okay. And they're also radially symmetrical. Okay, so magnolias are an example of what we would call a primitive flower. They're very beautiful though, aren't they? Yeah. Now advanced flowers, okay, tend to have fewer parts, and some parts tend to be fused together. Okay. They have inferior ovaries. It means the ovary is below the attachment point of the rest of the flower. Okay, they have spiral arrangements, are compressed to whorls, so you just have a few, maybe leaf-like structures or a few sepals, a few petals, okay, to whorls of petals and sepals and stamens. And oftentimes they're bilaterally symmetrical. Do you remember radially symmetrical and bilaterally symmetrical? Well, for example, we have an orchid. So here we have a picture of a Paphliopetalum. Okay. And you can see that the flower is bilaterally symmetrical. If you cut it in half longitudinally this way, you would have mirror images. Not just that, is that in this flower, yeah, these are, here's a sepal. Here are two sepals that are fused. Okay, here's a petal, here's another petal, and here's a third petal which is differentiated into the lip. Then the orchid flower also has a column, a fused sexual structure. It has the anther cap at the tip with the pollinia inside, which is like a mass of pollen. And then the stigma is like a concave space with sticky fluid in it on the same structure as the anther is, or the stamen is. Okay? So that's some examples of some plants that are of more advanced characteristics. Okay? The orchid is paramount among them. Okay? So in terms of pollination ecology, okay? So pollinators co-evolve with plants. Okay? In some of these relationships, the relationship is so complicated that it's very hard to really know who actually initiated the relationship and who actually ended it. Okay? But what happens is that you have these pollinator relationships, pollinator specificity, where the pollinator pollinates only one species of flower. Now, only a lavender orchid, say for example, not the white orchid. That's very looks like it and maybe even smells a little like it, but maybe they don't, the bee is not necessarily attracted to a white flowered plant. Okay? So pollinators co-evolve with plants and relationships can be very highly specialized. Okay? So some of the animal pollinators include bees. So they tend to pollinate blue flowers or yellow flowers. Okay? An example locally is the Chinese violet, Acacia gangetica. Look, there's even a place for the bee to crawl in here to get the pollen. Okay? And we have Weidelia, which is an Asteraceae member of a composite. Okay? It's a yellow flower. It looks like a single yellow flower. It's maybe about an inch wide in diameter, but it's actually a grouping of flowers in a head, capitulum. Now, beetles tend to pollinate yeasty, spicy, or fruity odors kind of flower, okay? And they tend to be white or dull, such as some types of water lilies are pollinated by beetles, okay? Fly-pollinated flowers, what are flies attracted to? They're attracted to what will repel us, right? So it's usually a stinky kind of smell, rotten meat or rotten fish or fecal matter, okay? So flies, they tend to be attracted to these because then they can lay their eggs in them, and the maggots can feast on this organic matter that they're laid on. Okay, so Stapelia gigantea, that's a plant that we can see here in Hawaii in some dry areas. Okay, it's not a cactus. It looks like a cactus or a euphorbia, but it's not. It's actually in a different family. Okay. You have night-active moths. Okay, they tend to pollinate flowers that are white or light in color and that are sweetly fragrant in odor, such as gardenias. We have some native species of gardenias as well that were probably pollinated by moths. There's an angricum, which is a kind of orchid that can be 18 inches long in terms of including the spur, and that Charles Darwin actually predicted that it would be pollinated by a moth. It's a white star-shaped orchid, maybe about this big, but about this long, and then that this moth would have a 10 to 12 inch proboscis or tongue, because the nectar is at the end of the spur, at the bottom of the spur, and it's actually like about a foot between the opening of the flower and the spur, bottom of the spur. Okay, so he predicted it and he was right. They actually discovered the pollinator 50 years after his death. Okay, and we also have butterflies. Okay, they tend to pollinate bright colored flowers, not so much red, but more like orangey blues and yellows, like lantana. You can see that, well, it's kind of hard to see, but they have this long tubular fused corolla or fused petals. Yeah. So lantana is an example of a butterfly pollinated flower. Okay. Birds like bright red or yellow flowers. And birds can't smell, with very few exceptions. Okay, so the flowers usually have little or no odor, right? They tend to be large enough to support the weight of a bird, and they also have copious nectar, because the nectar is what actually attracts the birds to them. Okay? So an example of this kind of flower are the California fuchsias. See how bright colored they are, tubular. Okay, so I guess hummingbirds would tend to pollinate these flowers. Bats tend to be dull, the flowers tend to be dull in color. Okay, large, open at night. Okay, so an example of this kind of plant is the organ pipe cactus. It's a nice photograph of a cactus there. Big plant. I like cacti. My husband doesn't like them either, though. But what we'll do is we'll kind of start on the orchid family, and we're going to stop in a little while. But the orchid family, okay, has approximately 35,000 species. So it's the largest family of flowering plants. Okay. They have pollen in sacs called pollinia, and with a sticky pad at the base. Okay, so they have catasetums. These are unisexual kind of orchids, which are unusual. Most orchids are bisexual. Okay, so these are, here are some, I think these are female flowers of catasetum. Okay, but the male catasetum flowers have a trigger. And what it does is that when the bee actually, a bee that is large enough actually touches the trigger, it dumps its pollinia right on the bee. Okay. Now, orphrys resembles a bee or a wasp. Okay, this is a European orchid of the grassland area or temperate areas. Okay, you can actually look at it and look, it does kind of look like an insect. Okay. Another thing is that to a male bee, it also smells like a bee. It smells like a female bee. So what they do is they try to mate with it. Okay, while they try to mate with it, they butt their heads against the anther cap. The pollinia gets dumped on their head, and they fly off to another orchid and tries to mate with that orchid, and then that's what they call pseudo-copulation. So these orchids actually trick the bee or wasp into trying to copulate with it or mate with it, and it actually dumps its pollen on them, and then they end up doing the job of the orchid without the orchid giving the bee any kind of reward at all. No sex, you know. Okay. Now, a South African kind of orchid called Disa has a pollinia gets attached to the tongue of a butterfly. And we have another kind of orchid, which is called the bucket orchid, which is called Coryanthes. And it's a very big orchid, kind of strangely shaped, but it actually has like a pool of water inside of it. Okay, and what happened is that the bee is actually on the orchid, slipping around, trying to get some oil from the orchid, trying to rub it on itself because it's trying to groom itself to make itself attracted to a female bee. And what happens is that the thing is slippery, so the bee will slide and fall into the pool of water inside the flower. And then what will happen is that the bee has to kind of climb out through kind of torturous means, and by that way it will actually contact the stigma and the anther. Yeah, so this is a way that the bee is trying to groom itself and trying to get itself attractive for a female bee. Okay? Anyway, so we'll close with the orchids for today, and we'll see you next time and continue with the angiosperms. Bye-bye. Aloha.